In ancient empires, sexual crimes were not understood primarily as violations of individual autonomy, but as offenses against family honor, social hierarchy, religion, and state authority. Laws regulating sexual behavior functioned as powerful tools of social control, reinforcing gender roles, class divisions, and political order. Imagine a world where your body does not belong to you, a world where your worth is measured not by your pain, not by your voice, but by the honor of the man who claims ownership over you. In the ancient world, sexual violence was not treated as a personal violation. It was treated as damage to property, as a disruption of order, as a threat to power. This is not a comfortable history, but it is a necessary one. Because sexual crimes in ancient empires were never just crimes. They were tools. Tools used to control families, to discipline women, to dominate enslaved people, and to stabilize empires built on hierarchy. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you value history told honestly, without softening the truth. And as you listen, I want you to tell me in the comments how these events make you feel. Do they shock you? Do they feel distant? Or do they feel disturbingly familiar? In the ancient world, the idea of consent as we understand it today did not exist. What mattered was not whether a person agreed, but whether the correct social boundaries had been crossed. A woman's sexuality was not considered her own. From birth, it was controlled first by her father, then by her husband, and ultimately by the state itself. When sexual violence occurred, the law did not ask whether the victim suffered. It asked whose authority had been violated. If a free woman was assaulted, the crime was against her male guardian. If an enslaved woman was assaulted, there was often no crime at all. Her body was already owned. This is the foundation upon which ancient sexual laws were built. Empires depended on order. They depended on predictable inheritance, clear bloodlines, and rigid social ranks. Sexual behavior threatened all of these. A child born outside of approved unions could destabilize property ownership. An unregulated relationship could blur class boundaries. A woman who controlled her own sexuality represented a breakdown in male authority. So empires responded with law. They turned intimacy into legislation, desire into discipline. The private body became a public concern. Sexual laws were carved into stone tablets, proclaimed in imperial courts, and enforced through brutal punishment. These laws did not exist to protect the vulnerable. They existed to protect the structure of society itself. Fear was essential to this system. Punishments were public and severe. Executions, mutilations, forced marriages, and exile were not hidden acts of justice. They were spectacles. They taught entire communities what would happen if they stepped outside their assigned roles. Shame did the rest of the work. Victims were silenced not through mercy, but through disgrace. A woman who had been violated could be punished for dishonoring her family. In some societies, her survival depended on whether the men around her chose to acknowledge her humanity. Sexual crime, in this context, was not an exception to the system. It was part of the system. Through these laws, empires controlled reproduction. They controlled lineage. They controlled who mattered and who did not. The body became a site of governance, and sexuality became a language of power. As we move forward in this series, we will see how these principles were written into law codes, justified through religion, and enforced through violence. We will see how elite men were protected, how enslaved people were erased, and how women were punished for crimes committed against them. This history is disturbing because it reveals something uncomfortable. These systems were not chaotic or accidental. They were deliberate, carefully designed, repeated across cultures and centuries. And while these empires have fallen, many of their ideas about power, sexuality, and control did not disappear with them. Not myths, not moral teachings, but rules etched into stone, enforced by kings, and carried out by courts and executioners. In the earliest empires, law was not abstract. It was visible, physical, and meant to endure. When rulers wanted control, They wrote it down where everyone could see it. In Mesopotamia, one of the world's first urban civilizations, sexual behavior was already tightly regulated. The Code of Hammurabi did not describe sexuality as a private matter. It described it as a legal risk to social order. Adultery was treated as a crime against a household, not against a person. If a married woman was accused of sleeping with another man, both could be executed. But if a husband chose to forgive, the state often stepped aside. His authority mattered more than her consent. Rape laws followed the same logic. The severity of punishment depended not on violence but on status. An assault against a free woman could bring harsh consequences. An assault against an enslaved woman often brought none at all. Her body was already considered accessible. In these laws, we see the central rule repeated again and again. Sexual harm only mattered when it disrupted male ownership. The Roman Empire refined this system even further. Roman law distinguished carefully between acceptable and unacceptable sex, not based on consent, but on hierarchy. A free male citizen was permitted a wide range of sexual access, as long as he did not violate the status of another free male. Sex with enslaved people was legal. Sex with prostitutes was legal. Sex with social inferiors was largely ignored by the courts. What mattered was not violence, but whether another citizen's honor had been compromised. When Rome criminalized adultery under Augustus, it was framed as a threat to the state itself. A woman's private actions became a public crime. Fathers were legally allowed to kill daughters caught in adultery. Husbands were expected to report wives. The empire inserted itself directly into the bedroom. This was not about morality. It was about control. By turning sexual behavior into a matter of public law, the state expanded its reach into the most intimate spaces of life. Loyalty to the empire was enforced through obedience of the body. And yet these laws were never applied equally. Elite men rarely faced the punishments written in the statutes. Legal flexibility favored those with power. Accusations could be dismissed. Witnesses could be discredited. Silence could be bought. For women, the law was rigid. For enslaved people, it barely existed. Across empires, the same pattern appears. Sexual crime laws protected male authority, preserved class boundaries, and reinforced political stability. Victims were secondary, often invisible. Religion did not soften this system. It strengthened it. In many ancient societies, sexual laws were presented as divine commands. To disobey was not just illegal, it was sacrilegious. Purity laws linked sexuality to cosmic order. A violation of sexual norms was framed as an offense against the gods themselves. This made resistance nearly impossible. When law and divinity merged, punishment became unquestionable. But perhaps the most disturbing use of sexual violence was not found in courtrooms at all. It was found on battlefields. During conquest, sexual violence functioned as a language of domination. To violate the bodies of conquered populations was to demonstrate absolute power. It humiliated enemies, shattered communities, and signaled the complete collapse of resistance. Women's bodies became symbols of victory. Their suffering became proof of imperial supremacy. And this violence was rarely punished. Armies operated beyond civilian law. Conquest granted permission. These acts were not random. They were understood, expected, and embedded within imperial logic. As you listen to this, it becomes clear that sexual crimes in ancient empires cannot be separated from politics. They were not failures of the system. They were features of it. Through law, religion, and violence, empires taught people where they belonged. Who could act, who must submit, who mattered. And long after the empires fell, these ideas endured, passed down through legal traditions, religious doctrines, and social customs. This history forces a difficult realization. The control of sexuality has always been about more than sex. It has been about power. As we move deeper into this history, the focus shifts from law and conquest to the structure that made all of it feel natural, inevitable, and justified. Patriarchy. In ancient empires, patriarchy was not simply a social attitude. It was a governing system. Male authority was the organizing principle of family, law, economy, and religion. Sexual control was one of its most effective tools. From birth, women were defined by their relationship to men. A daughter represented future alliances, future offspring, future honor. Her sexuality was guarded not for her sake, but for what it symbolized. Virginity was not about morality, it was about certainty, certainty of lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy. This is why sexual crimes against women were framed so differently from crimes against men. A woman who was assaulted did not lose safety. She lost value. The law responded not to her trauma, but to the perceived damage done to male ownership. In many societies, a raped woman could be forced to marry her attacker. The logic was not compassion, it was restoration. Marriage repaired honor by transferring control from one man to another. The violence itself was treated as secondary. If a woman resisted loudly, publicly, violently enough, the law might recognize her innocence. Silence, fear, shock. These were often interpreted as consent. The burden of proof rested on the victim's performance of suffering. Men, by contrast, were rarely defined by sexual vulnerability. A man violated sexually threatened the entire gender hierarchy. Such cases were either erased from records or reframed as moral corruption rather than violence. Patriarchy depended on the idea that men acted and women were acted upon. Sexual laws reinforced this belief relentlessly. Class intensified these dynamics. Elite women were controlled tightly because their reproductive capacity mattered politically. Their bodies were sites of alliance and inheritance. Surveillance was constant. Punishment was severe. Lower-class women faced a different reality. Their labor and bodies were considered expendable. Protection was minimal. Justice was inconsistent. For enslaved women, sexual violence was not a crime. It was an expectation. Enslavement erased consent entirely. The law assumed perpetual availability. Sexual access was treated as a right of ownership. Children born from these violations inherited the status of the mother, ensuring that violence reproduced the labor force itself. This was not accidental. It was economic design. Sexual exploitation sustained empire by sustaining slavery. And yet the system required silence to function. Victims were discouraged from speaking through shame, fear, and disbelief. Communities were trained to look away. Violence became normalized, even invisible. Religion played a critical role here. By framing sexual order as divinely mandated, ancient societies removed it from debate. Obedience became sacred. Transgression became sin. Female sexuality was portrayed as dangerous, chaotic, in need of control. Male authority was framed as protective, rational, ordained. These narratives justified punishment not as cruelty, but as correction. Even compassion became conditional. Mercy was granted only if it reinforced hierarchy. What emerges from this history is not a story of isolated brutality, but of coherence. Sexual control fit perfectly into imperial logic. It stabilized families, secured inheritance, reinforced class, and legitimized violence. Empires ruled not only through force, but through belief. Belief that this was the natural order of things. That belief did not vanish when the empires fell. It was absorbed into later legal systems, into religious traditions, into cultural assumptions that persisted for centuries. This is why studying ancient sexual crimes is not an exercise in distant horror. It is an examination of foundations. The question is not whether these systems were cruel. They were. The question is how much of them we still recognize. That belief, that hierarchy, control, and silence are natural, did not remain confined to the ancient world. It traveled forward quietly and efficiently, carried by law, ritual, and tradition. What began as imperial necessity hardened into cultural instinct. As empires expanded, they learned that controlling bodies was often more effective than controlling borders. Sexual regulation became a way to govern populations without constant violence. People learned to police themselves. Families enforced rules long before courts needed to intervene. Fear was inherited. The shame placed on victims was essential to this process. When suffering is private and punishment is public, power does not need to explain itself. Silence becomes survival. Communities absorb the lesson and pass it down. This is why sexual crimes were rarely framed as trauma. Trauma invites empathy. Empathy invites resistance. Ancient systems could not afford that. Instead, sexual violation was described in terms of disorder, impurity, and transgression. The language itself redirected blame away from perpetrators and toward those whose bodies had been violated. Law and culture worked together to make this redirection feel reasonable. Even when reforms appeared, they rarely challenged the foundation. Laws might shift, punishments might soften, but the underlying logic remained intact. Sexuality existed to serve order, not individuals. Nowhere is this more visible than in the transition from conquest to governance. In newly conquered territories, sexual violence functioned as terror. It broke resistance quickly. It fractured families. It made domination undeniable. But once rule was established, empires needed stability. Unchecked violence became disruptive. So conquest violence was gradually replaced with regulated exploitation. Marriage laws, concubinage, and legalized prostitution absorbed what open brutality had once expressed. The result was control without chaos. The system appeared civilized, even merciful, while preserving the same hierarchy. This transformation is important. It shows that sexual control was adaptable. It could take many forms while maintaining the same purpose. And always, the law stood ready to intervene, never neutrally, never evenly. When sexual crimes crossed class boundaries, punishment followed. When they reinforced them, silence prevailed. Men of power were rarely punished for sexual violence. When they were, it was usually because they threatened another powerful man's authority, not because they harmed someone without power. Justice, in the ancient world, was not blind. It knew exactly who it served. As generations passed, these systems became tradition. What was once imposed by force was later taught as morality. Children learned it before they could question it. By the time they encountered law, the law felt familiar. This is how control becomes invisible. The ancient world did not invent sexual violence, but it perfected its use as governance. And that is the most unsettling realization of all. Because when violence is structured, justified, and normalized, it does not feel like violence anymore. It feels like order. When violence feels like order, questioning it feels like rebellion, and rebellion in ancient empires was dangerous. This is why deviation from sexual norms was treated so harshly. It was never just about sex, it was about disobedience. A woman who acted outside prescribed boundaries was not simply immoral, she was unstable, threatening, disruptive. A man who violated sexual hierarchy challenged the social ladder itself. The response was discipline. Punishment was designed to be instructive. It taught the individual their place, and it reminded everyone else where theirs was. Bodies became warnings, lives became examples. Public trials, forced confessions, and ritualized punishments were not excesses of cruelty. They were performances of power. Each one reinforced the message that authority reached everywhere, even into desire, even into the most private corners of human life. And yet, for all this control, the system depended on contradictions. Men were granted sexual freedom, but only within hierarchy. Women were denied autonomy, but expected to maintain purity. Enslaved people were denied protection, but expected to remain silent. These contradictions created constant tension, and tension required constant enforcement. This is where community complicity became crucial. Families enforced sexual discipline long before the state intervened. Fathers, husbands, elders, and religious figures acted as extensions of imperial authority. Control was decentralized. Violence could be intimate, familiar, and justified as love or duty. In this way, empires did not need to watch everyone. People learned to watch each other. Accusations became weapons. Reputation became currency. Fear of scandal often mattered more than fear of law. The threat of being labeled impure, dishonorable, or corrupt could destroy lives without a single court appearance. This social surveillance was especially devastating for women. Their movements, clothing, speech, and relationships were monitored constantly. A rumor could be enough. Proof was not always required. Suspicion alone could justify punishment. And once marked, a woman rarely recovered. Men, by contrast, moved more freely through these systems. Even when accused, their status often shielded them. Their transgressions could be reframed as excess, desire, or error. Authority softened judgment. This imbalance was not a flaw. It was the design. Because patriarchy is not maintained by strength alone. It is maintained by uneven consequences. Over time, the language of control grew more refined. Brutality gave way to morality. Violence gave way to virtue. Sexual obedience was no longer just enforced, it was praised. Chastity became a symbol of goodness. Submission became a sign of honor. Silence became dignity. These ideals did not emerge naturally. They were cultivated, repeated, ritualized. Religion, poetry, philosophy, and law all participated in this process. Together, they transformed domination into destiny. By the later stages of empire, many people no longer experienced sexual control as oppression. They experienced it as tradition, as righteousness, as the way things had always been. That is the final achievement of social control, when the controlled defend the system that controls them. This is the inheritance ancient empires left behind, not just laws carved into stone, but assumptions carved into thought. As we move closer to the end of this journey, the question becomes unavoidable. If these systems shape the past so thoroughly, how much of them still shape the present? That question, how much of this still shapes the present, cannot be answered without first confronting how long these systems survived after the empires themselves collapsed. Empires fell, cities burned, dynasties ended. But sexual control did not disappear with them. It adapted. The legal language changed, but the logic endured. Religious authorities inherited the role once held by kings. Moral codes replaced imperial decrees. What had once been enforced by soldiers was now enforced by conscience. Sexual behavior remained a measure of obedience. In many post-imperial societies, laws governing sexuality grew even more intrusive. The body became a site of constant moral evaluation. Desire was framed as dangerous. Pleasure became suspicious. Discipline was praised as virtue. And once again, the burden fell unevenly. Women were expected to embody restraint. Their worth was tied to purity, modesty, and obedience. Sexual violence against them was still filtered through questions of honor and reputation. Survival did not guarantee dignity. Men retained authority over interpretation. They defined transgression. They granted forgiveness. They controlled narrative. These patterns were not accidents of culture. They were inherited structures. What makes this history so difficult is not just its cruelty, but its familiarity. Many of the assumptions forged in ancient empires continue to echo in modern debates about sexuality, morality, and power. Who is believed? Who is blamed? Whose body is regulated? Whose desire is forgiven? These questions are ancient. And that is why this history matters. Because understanding sexual crimes in ancient empires is not about condemning the past. It is about recognizing continuity. It is about seeing how systems of control evolve without ever truly disappearing. The ancient world teaches us that sexual violence thrives where hierarchy is rigid, where silence is rewarded, and where power defines truth. It teaches us that law alone cannot protect the vulnerable if the law is designed to protect authority. And it teaches us something else, something unsettling. That progress is not guaranteed. Every generation must choose whether to repeat these systems or to challenge them. Empires do not need armies to return. They return through ideas, through unexamined traditions, through unquestioned norms, through the belief that control is natural. As this series comes closer to its end, remember this: history is not distant. It lives in us. It shapes how we speak, how we judge, how we remain silent. The ancient empires are gone, but their shadows remain. And whether those shadows continue is not a question for historians alone. As we enter this final stretch, it is important to understand that endings in history are rarely clean. There is no single moment where these systems collapse and disappear. There is only slow erosion, resistance, and repetition. Even in the ancient world, these structures were never uncontested. There were women who resisted in the only ways available to them, through silence, through flight, through refusal, through survival. There were enslaved people who formed relationships outside the gaze of law, reclaiming fragments of autonomy where they could. There were philosophers who questioned excess, religious figures who condemned abuse, communities that quietly bent the rules. But resistance existed at the margins. Power remained at the center, and power, when threatened, adapts. When overt brutality became politically costly, it was replaced with regulation. When regulation became visible, it was reframed as morality. When morality became questioned, it was sanctified as tradition. This adaptability is why sexual control endured for so long. It was never static. It evolved alongside empire. And perhaps the most effective part of that evolution was forgetting. Forgetting the violence that created the system. Forgetting the suffering that sustained it. Forgetting that what feels natural was once imposed. History remembers laws and rulers. It often forgets victims. That forgetting is itself a form of control. By recovering these histories, by naming the systems rather than individualizing the cruelty, we resist that erasure. We shift the focus away from isolated acts and toward structures, away from scandal and toward power. This does not bring justice to the past. Nothing can. But it can change how we understand the present. Because the ancient world shows us something essential. Sexual violence is not only a crime of individuals. It is a crime that flourishes within systems that reward silence, privilege authority, and normalize inequality. Remove those conditions, and violence loses its protection. This is not an argument that history inevitably repeats itself. It is a reminder that repetition happens when patterns go unrecognized. Empires controlled sexuality because it worked. It stabilized hierarchy. It disciplined populations. It maintained order. But it also came at a cost measured in lives, in silence, in generations taught to accept domination as destiny. The lesson of this history is not despair, it is awareness. Because once control is seen clearly, it becomes harder to justify, harder to excuse, harder to pass down unquestioned. The ancient empires are often admired for their architecture, their laws, their achievements. Rarely are they remembered for how deeply they governed the body, but that governance was central to their power, and understanding that changes how we understand empire itself. This is where we leave the past, not resolved, not redeemed, but exposed. And with that exposure comes responsibility. Because once a system is seen clearly, neutrality is no longer innocent. To understand how sexual control functioned in ancient empires is to understand how power learns, survives, and disguises itself. It teaches us that domination does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in language like order, morality, tradition, or protection. Ancient rulers understood something fundamental. Controlling sexuality was one of the fastest ways to control society. It reached into families. It shaped identity. It dictated belonging. It taught people who they were allowed to be. That knowledge did not vanish with time. It was inherited. And that inheritance places us at a crossroads. We can treat this history as distant and resolved, or we can recognize it as unfinished. We can admire ancient civilizations without interrogating the cost at which their stability was achieved. Or we can hold both truths at once, the brilliance and the brutality. History becomes dangerous when it is simplified. The purpose of revisiting these narratives is not to assign modern guilt to the past. It is to sharpen perception, to recognize patterns, to understand how easily violence can be normalized when it serves power. Because the ancient world teaches us something sobering, systems do not need to be cruel to be effective. They only need to be accepted. And acceptance is built through repetition, through stories told one way and not another, through laws that claim neutrality while enforcing hierarchy, through silence that feels safer than resistance. If there is a final thread running through this entire history, it is this: sexual crimes in ancient empires were not aberrations. They were expressions of a worldview where control mattered more than consent, and order mattered more than humanity. Seeing that clearly does not change the past, but it can change how we listen, how we question, and how we respond when similar logics appear in our own time. That awareness is not comfortable. That clarity, once it settles in, invites a deeper kind of listening, one that reaches beyond laws and institutions and into the rhythms of everyday life in the ancient world. Because social control did not operate only through courts or punishments, it lived in routine, it lived in habit, it lived in what people learned to expect from themselves and from others. From a young age, individuals were trained into their roles. Boys learned entitlement long before they learned responsibility. Girls learned restraint long before they learned desire. These lessons were not always spoken aloud. They were absorbed through observation, through correction, through fear of consequence. A girl learned quickly that her body was watched, not only by family but by neighbors, elders, and religious figures. A glance held too long, a step taken alone, a word spoken out of turn, each carried risk. Surveillance became internal, control became self-enforced. This was one of the most effective mechanisms ancient empires ever produced. When people discipline themselves, power no longer needs to intervene constantly. The empire could rule from a distance while families carried out its work, and families did so with conviction. Fathers believed they were protecting honor. Mothers believed they were preparing daughters for survival. Elders believed they were preserving tradition. Very few saw themselves as enforcers of oppression. Most believed they were doing what was necessary. That belief mattered. Because when control is framed as care, resistance becomes betrayal. To question the system is to question one's family, one's faith, one's identity. This is how deeply sexual regulation embedded itself into culture. Marriage, for example, was rarely about affection. It was a transaction between families, between clans, between social classes. Sexual access was one of its currencies. Consent was irrelevant if the agreement was valid. A woman's refusal could be overridden by law. A man's refusal rarely mattered. Once married, expectations were clear. Female fidelity was mandatory. Male fidelity was optional. Any deviation from this imbalance threatened the social order, so it was policed relentlessly. Punishments were not only legal, they were social. Ostracism, humiliation, loss of protection. These consequences often lasted longer than any formal sentence. And again, status determined everything. An elite woman's scandal could shake political alliances. A poor woman's violation could disappear without record. An enslaved woman's suffering was routine, unremarkable, expected. Sexual violence was stratified. Pain followed hierarchy. Yet within this rigid structure, desire did not vanish. It adapted. It moved underground. It expressed itself through secrecy, through coded language, through forbidden encounters. And the system responded with suspicion. Accusations multiplied. Fear fed paranoia. Communities learned to see threat everywhere. Sexual anxiety became a constant background presence, shaping behavior even when no crime had occurred. This anxiety served power well. A population that fears transgression is easier to govern than one that questions authority. Sexual fear, in particular, keeps people inward-looking, cautious, divided. Empires understood this instinctively. That is why sexual crimes were so often punished more harshly than theft, violence, or even murder. A stolen object could be replaced. A disrupted hierarchy could not. Sexual control was about protecting structure, not people, and that structure demanded sacrifice. Countless lives were narrowed, silenced, or destroyed to maintain an idea of order that benefited very few. The suffering was normalized because it was distributed unevenly. Those with power rarely experienced the full weight of the system they defended. This asymmetry is crucial. It explains why reform was so slow, why empathy rarely translated into change, why cruelty could coexist with civilization. Empires celebrated philosophy, art, and law while simultaneously regulating bodies with precision and brutality. These were not contradictions, they were complementary. Culture flourished on the surface, control operated beneath it. And so, when we look back at the ancient world, we must resist the temptation to isolate sexual crimes as moral failures of individuals. They were systemic outcomes, predictable, reproducible. They happened because the system required them. Understanding this does not absolve perpetrators, but it shifts responsibility upward toward the structures that enabled, excused, and normalized harm. That shift is uncomfortable. It removes the comfort of distance. It suggests that violence is not only a matter of bad people, but of accepted rules. And that realization carries weight. Because if rules can produce violence, then changing rules can reduce it, but only if those rules are seen for what they are. Ancient empires relied on silence to survive. Silence of victims, silence of witnesses, silence of history itself. Breaking that silence, by speaking, by remembering, by naming, is an act of resistance, even centuries later. And resistance, no matter how late, still matters. So as this narration continues, let it slow you down, let it unsettle you. Let it complicate what you thought you knew about power, morality, and progress. Because the story of sexual crimes and social control is not a side story of empire. And once that foundation is exposed, it becomes impossible to ignore how carefully it was maintained across time, space, and culture. Ancient empires differed in language, religion, and customs, but they converged on one principle with remarkable consistency. Control over sexuality was control over society. This was not coincidence. It was learned behavior, refined through generations of governance. Rulers watched what worked. They observed that fear surrounding sex was more durable than fear of punishment alone. Sexual shame lingered. It followed people home. It outlived rulers. It embedded itself into identity. So empires invested in it. They legislated it, ritualized it, and mythologized it. Stories warned of women whose desire brought ruin. Tales praised men who exercised dominance as strength. Religious texts encoded obedience as virtue. Over time, these narratives stopped feeling imposed and began to feel inevitable. This is how power becomes invisible. Once invisible, it becomes difficult to challenge because it no longer announces itself as force. It presents itself as common sense. A woman restricted in movement was said to be protected. A girl married young was said to be secured. A violation ignored was said to be unfortunate but unavoidable. Language softened what reality made brutal. And language mattered. Words determined whether an act was named as violence or dismissed as fate, whether a victim was pitied or blamed, whether an aggressor was condemned or excused. Ancient legal texts are full of this linguistic maneuvering. Harm is often described indirectly. Responsibility is shifted. Outcomes are negotiated between men, while the person most affected is barely mentioned. Absence speaks loudly. It tells us whose voices mattered and whose did not. This absence also explains why resistance so rarely appears in official records. People without legal standing leave few written traces. Their stories survive only in fragments, in silences, in what must be inferred rather than read directly. But those silences are not empty. They are full of lives constrained by fear and expectation, fear of accusation, fear of dishonor, fear of abandonment, fear of death. These fears shaped choices. They determined whom one could trust, where one could go, how one could speak. Sexual control was not limited to moments of violence. It structured entire lifetimes. And yet the system depended on denial. Denial that harm was harm. Denial that inequality was injustice. Denial that control was coercion. As long as these denials held, the system functioned. But denial is fragile. It cracks when contradictions grow too visible, when the cost becomes too high, when belief no longer aligns with lived experience. Throughout history, moments of questioning did arise. Philosophers debated excess. Religious reformers spoke of restraint and compassion. Legal scholars proposed limits. These moments mattered, but they rarely overturned the foundation. Why? Because sexual control was never just ideological. It was material. It affected inheritance, labor, citizenship, and power. Too many interests depended on it remaining intact. Change threatened stability, and empires always chose stability over justice. This is not unique to the ancient world, but the ancient world perfected the template. That template teaches us how systems survive criticism, by absorbing it, by appearing to change while preserving hierarchy, by offering symbolic reform without structural transformation. A law may be softened, but enforcement remains selective. A punishment may be reduced, but blame remains unchanged. A victim may be acknowledged, but authority remains unquestioned. These patterns repeat because they work, and recognizing that is unsettling, because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. Progress is not automatic. It must be defended deliberately, or it erodes quietly. The ancient empires show us what happens when power is left unchecked for centuries. Control becomes tradition. Violence becomes normalized. Silence becomes wisdom. Breaking that cycle requires more than condemnation of the past. It requires vigilance in the present, because the same logic still appears whenever order is prioritized over dignity, whenever reputation matters more than harm, whenever authority is trusted more than experience. History does not accuse, it reveals. And what it reveals here is clear. Sexual crimes in ancient empires were not deviations from civilization. They were mechanisms through which civilization, as it was defined then, sustained itself. That does not mean civilization must be built this way, but it does mean we must be honest about how often it has been. And honesty, once embraced, reshapes responsibility. So as this narration continues, let it remain slow. Let it remain heavy. These are not ideas meant to be rushed past or neatly concluded. And when that change in perception begins, it often brings discomfort because it reveals how deeply these ancient patterns shaped not only institutions, but emotions themselves. Shame, for example, did not arise naturally. It was cultivated, carefully taught, repeated until it felt internal rather than imposed. Ancient societies learned that shame was more efficient than chains. A person who feels shame will limit themselves long before authority intervenes. Sexual shame was especially effective. It attached itself to the body, to memory, to identity. It followed people even when no law was present. It lingered in private moments, shaping choices that no ruler ever had to command directly. This is why sexual control survived periods of political instability. Dynasties fell, borders shifted, rulers changed, but the regulation of sexuality remained remarkably consistent. It had already been absorbed into culture. Children learned it early. They learned which questions not to ask, which topics to avoid, which behaviors brought approval and which brought punishment. By the time they encountered formal law, The law felt like confirmation, not coercion. This is the quiet brilliance of social control, when authority feels like common sense. And because it felt normal, it was rarely recorded as violence. What was normalized did not need explanation. What was expected did not need justification. This is why so many ancient sources describe sexual punishment without commentary, without outrage, without acknowledgement of suffering. The writers were not cruel in the way we imagine. They were accustomed. That habituation is one of the most dangerous legacies of empire, because when suffering is familiar, it becomes invisible. It is also why empathy, when it appears in ancient texts, feels so striking. A single line expressing compassion stands out because it breaks the pattern. It reminds us that alternative ways of seeing always existed, even if they were marginalized. But marginalized voices rarely shape systems. Power shapes systems. And power, in ancient empires, was deeply invested in keeping sexual order rigid. Not only because it controlled women and enslaved people, but because it stabilized male identity. Masculinity itself was structured around dominance, access, and authority. A man's status was reinforced by what he was permitted to do to others and whose bodies were denied agency. To challenge sexual hierarchy was to challenge masculinity, and to challenge masculinity was to challenge the social order. This made reform dangerous. Men who questioned sexual violence risked being seen as weak. Communities that protected victims risked being seen as disorderly. Compassion itself could be framed as subversive. So the system protected itself by redefining virtue. Virtue became obedience. Virtue became restraint. For some, excess for others. Virtue became knowing one's place. And knowing one's place was the highest moral achievement. This moral framing allowed people to participate in harm without seeing themselves as harmful. A father enforcing control believed he was acting responsibly. A judge issuing punishment believed he was preserving order. A community turning away believed it was avoiding chaos. Intentions mattered less than outcomes, but intentions protected consciences. This is another lesson ancient empires leave behind. Systems do not require villains to function. They require participation. And participation is easier when responsibility is diffuse. No single act appears decisive. No individual feels fully accountable. Harm is spread across decisions, across roles, across generations. This diffusion makes systems resilient. It also makes them difficult to dismantle. Because dismantling a system like this requires more than changing laws. It requires changing beliefs, habits, and emotional responses that feel deeply personal but are historically constructed. Ancient empires did not just rule land. They ruled imagination. They defined what was thinkable, what was speakable, what was survivable. Sexual control was central to that rule, not because sex was inherently dangerous, but because it touched everything: family, reproduction, identity, power. Control it, and much else falls into place. This is why, even when empires faced crisis, famine, invasion, rebellion, sexual laws were rarely relaxed. If anything, they were enforced more strictly. Control tightened as uncertainty grew. Fear seeks order. Power offers it. And often, the cost is borne by those least able to resist. As this narration continues, the weight of this history may feel heavy. That heaviness is not accidental. It reflects the cumulative impact of centuries of normalized control. But heaviness can also clarify. It slows us down. It demands attention. It prevents easy conclusions. And that is where understanding begins. Not in outrage alone, and not in distance, but in sustained attention to how power operates, quietly, persistently, and often through the most intimate parts of human life. This is the inheritance of ancient empire, and it is still unfolding. And because it is still unfolding, the most difficult part of this history is not what is foreign to us, but what is familiar. When we listen closely, we begin to recognize the echoes. Not identical laws, not identical punishments, but familiar logics. The idea that order must be preserved at any cost. The belief that certain bodies require more regulation than others. The instinct to doubt, to minimize, to redirect blame when harm disrupts comfort. These instincts did not emerge spontaneously, they were trained. Ancient empires trained populations to associate sexual regulation with stability. When people feared chaos, they tightened control. When societies felt threatened, they retreated into hierarchy. Sexual discipline became a symbolic defense against uncertainty. This pattern repeated itself whenever empires expanded too quickly, whenever borders blurred, whenever populations mixed. Anxiety about purity, of bloodlines, of culture, of belief, found expression in anxiety about bodies. Sexual control became a way to draw boundaries when political ones felt fragile. And once again, women, children, and the enslaved absorbed the consequences. Their bodies became sites where fear was managed and power was reassured. Control over them created the illusion of control over the world. This illusion mattered, because empires, despite their displays of strength, were always unstable. They depended on extraction, coercion, and constant enforcement. Sexual regulation provided something that armies could not: intimacy with authority. It entered homes, relationships, and self-concepts. It made power personal. When people internalized rules about their own bodies, the empire no longer needed to be present. Its values lived inside them. This is why the fall of empires did not automatically bring liberation. Removing rulers did not remove the beliefs they cultivated. Control lingered, detached from its original source, and in some cases, it intensified. New authorities inherited old tools. They found sexual regulation useful and continued it under new justifications. What had once been imperial necessity became moral certainty. Over time, the origin of these controls was forgotten. They were no longer recognized as strategies of governance. They were experienced as truth. That forgetting is one of the most enduring victories of ancient power. Because when a system no longer appears historical, it appears natural. And what appears natural is rarely questioned. This is why returning to ancient history matters. Not to judge it by modern standards, but to unmask its mechanisms. To see how power operates beneath the surface of law, religion, and tradition. Once those mechanisms are visible, they cannot easily be unseen. We begin to recognize that sexual violence does not exist in isolation. It clusters where authority is concentrated, where inequality is justified, where silence is rewarded. It flourishes when victims are expected to endure rather than be believed. Ancient empires created ideal conditions for this to occur, and then normalized it so thoroughly that it became invisible. The danger of invisibility is not only that harm continues, but that it loses language. When people cannot name what is happening to them, they cannot resist it. When communities lack the words to describe injustice, they reinterpret suffering as personal failure. This is not ancient, this is human, and it is precisely why historical clarity matters. Because history gives language back to experience. It reveals patterns. It restores context. It reminds us that what feels inevitable was once designed. Design implies choice, and choice implies responsibility. The ancient world shows us that societies can choose control over compassion, order over dignity, hierarchy over humanity, and sustain those choices for centuries. But it also shows us that these choices require constant reinforcement. They are not self-sustaining. They depend on belief. Belief that authority is necessary. Belief that inequality is justified. Belief that silence is safer than truth. When belief falters, systems strain. This is why knowledge is unsettling. It destabilizes belief. It introduces alternatives. It makes the familiar strange. And once the familiar is strange, it can be questioned. As this narration continues to unfold, remember that its purpose is not to overwhelm you with darkness. It is to illuminate structure, to show how power learned to govern not only land and labor, but bodies and desire. Because only by understanding that history can we recognize when similar logics appear again, wearing new language, new symbols, new justifications. The ancient empires do not haunt us because they were cruel. They haunt us because they were effective. And effectiveness, when left unexamined, is the most dangerous legacy of all. And effectiveness is seductive. It convinces societies that results justify methods, that stability excuses suffering, that control is preferable to uncertainty. Ancient empires learned this lesson early, and they taught it well. They taught it so well that even those harmed by the system were often compelled to defend it. This is one of the most painful truths in this history. People did not simply endure sexual control. Many internalized it. They repeated its logic. They passed it on. Mothers warned daughters to be careful, not because they believed the world was just, but because they knew it was not. Survival required adaptation. Silence became a skill. Compliance became strategy. This is how oppression reproduces itself without constant force. And when compliance is framed as wisdom, resistance appears reckless. Those who spoke out were not only punished, they were blamed for the consequences that followed. Disorder was attributed to disobedience, not to the system that provoked it. This reversal of responsibility was crucial. It allowed empires to present themselves as guardians of order rather than producers of harm. Sexual violence could then be described as tragedy rather than policy, as exception rather than outcome. But the patterns were too consistent to be accidental. Across regions and centuries, the same groups were vulnerable, the same acts were excused, the same justifications were repeated. Control flowed in one direction, protection in another. This consistency tells us something important. Sexual crimes in ancient empires were predictable. They followed power. Where power was concentrated, accountability was weak. Where power was absent, vulnerability was constant. And because power defined truth, the experiences of the powerless were often dismissed, doubted, or erased. Not because they were unbelievable, but because believing them threatened hierarchy. Hierarchy always resists narratives that expose its cost. This is why historical records are so uneven, why we hear the voices of lawmakers more often than victims, why punishment is described in detail but pain is not. It is not that suffering was invisible. It is that it was inconvenient. Yet even in this imbalance, traces remain, in laws that overcompensate with severity, in rituals that obsess over purity, in myths that warn against desire. These are not signs of moral clarity. They are signs of anxiety. Anxiety about control slipping, anxiety about boundaries dissolving, anxiety about power being challenged. Sexual control thrived on this anxiety. It promised certainty in an uncertain world. It offered clear roles where life felt unstable. It reassured rulers and communities alike that chaos could be managed if only bodies were disciplined enough. But discipline has a cost. It narrows lives. It limits possibility. It turns difference into danger. Over time, that cost accumulates. Creativity diminishes. Trust erodes. Fear replaces connection. The society becomes orderly, but brittle. Ancient empires rarely recognized this brittleness until it was too late. They mistook compliance for loyalty, silence for consent, stability for health. And when those illusions fractured through rebellion, collapse, or transformation, the systems that once seemed eternal revealed how fragile they were. Yet even then, sexual control often survived the fall. It detached from empire and embedded itself into successor cultures, religious frameworks, and social norms. This persistence is not proof of its righteousness. It is proof of its utility to power. Power remembers what works. And what worked was regulating intimacy, shaping identity, and making control feel moral. Understanding this history does not require us to reject all tradition or authority. It requires us to ask harder questions about them. Who benefits? Who pays the cost? Whose voices are missing? These questions were dangerous in the ancient world. They remain uncomfortable now, but discomfort is often the first sign that clarity is forming. As this narration continues, let that clarity deepen. Let it move beyond shock and into understanding. Because understanding is what allows us to see systems, not just events, and systems are where real change begins. The ancient empires ruled bodies to rule societies. That is not just a fact of history, it is a warning. And warnings, when ignored, have a way of repeating themselves. The ancient world shows us that sexual control was never maintained by violence alone. Violence was the edge of the system, not its core. At the core was normalization, the slow process by which extraordinary harm became ordinary, expected, and even justified. Once harm becomes ordinary, outrage fades. Once outrage fades, accountability disappears. And when accountability disappears, power no longer needs to hide. This is why so many ancient sexual laws read with such cold precision. They are not emotional documents, they are administrative ones. They catalog bodies the way other laws catalog land, livestock, or labor. That comparison is not accidental. In imperial logic, bodies were resources. Reproductive bodies produced heirs. Enslaved bodies produced labor. Female bodies produced alliances. Sexual access was woven into economic and political calculation. To disrupt that access was to disrupt empire. This is why sexual crimes were punished not according to suffering, but according to impact on order. A violation that threatened inheritance could trigger death. A violation that reinforced hierarchy could be ignored. The same act could be crime or privilege, depending on who committed it and against whom. This conditional morality is one of the clearest fingerprints of power. True moral systems apply consistently. Imperial systems do not. They apply strategically. And strategy requires flexibility. When public opinion shifted, rulers adjusted rhetoric. When resistance grew, punishment intensified. When stability returned, enforcement softened. The system breathed, adapted, recalibrated, always protecting its core interests. Those interests were rarely aligned with justice. Justice would have required recognizing victims as subjects rather than objects. It would have required listening to those without power. It would have required challenging male authority, class hierarchy, and ownership itself. Empire could not survive that challenge, so instead it offered order without justice, morality without empathy, law without consent. And many accepted that trade-off. They accepted it because alternatives were dangerous, because questioning sexual hierarchy risked exile, death, or social ruin, because survival often required silence. This does not make those people weak, it makes them human. It also explains why change was so rare and so slow. Systems that govern survival leave little room for idealism. When the cost of resistance is everything, endurance becomes rational. This is another reason history must be read carefully. It is easy to judge the past harshly. It is harder and more honest to understand the constraints under which people lived. Understanding those constraints does not excuse cruelty, but it explains its persistence. And explanation is necessary if we want to prevent repetition. The ancient empires teach us that sexual violence flourishes where power is unchecked, where hierarchy is rigid, and where silence is safer than truth. These conditions are not ancient. They appear whenever authority resists accountability. That is why this history remains relevant. Not because we live under the same laws, but because we live under systems that still struggle with belief, blame, and power. The past does not tell us what to think. It shows us what to watch for. Watch for laws that prioritize reputation over harm. Watch for narratives that question victims more than perpetrators. Watch for moral language used to justify control. These are not relics, they are signals. Ancient empires collapsed for many reasons: economic strain, military defeat, internal conflict. But beneath those causes was a common weakness: Systems built on domination eventually exhaust themselves. They demand too much silence. They generate too much fear. They mistake control for cohesion. And when cohesion fails, no amount of discipline can restore it. Sexual control was a powerful tool, but it was never a stable foundation. It produced order, but not trust, compliance, but not loyalty, stability, but not resilience. This is the final irony of empire. In trying to control everything, it undermined the very humanity that could have sustained it. That is not just a lesson about the past. It is a reminder for the present. And with that reminder, the narration does not conclude. It opens outward, asking what kind of systems we are willing to inherit and which ones we are willing to dismantle. Because history does not demand repetition. It demands recognition. And recognition, once achieved, changes what is possible. And when recognition begins to take hold, it changes the way history is felt, not as something distant and complete, but as something unfinished, still moving through time. What becomes clear is that ancient empires did not simply fail morally in moments of excess. They succeeded structurally. Their systems worked exactly as designed. Sexual control maintained hierarchy. Hierarchy preserved power. Power protected itself. That success is what makes this history so difficult to confront, because it forces us to abandon comforting explanations. Sexual violence was not primarily the result of ignorance, chaos, or individual cruelty. It was the outcome of organized belief. It was reinforced by law, sanctified by religion, normalized by culture, and sustained by silence. Once that is understood, the focus shifts. And the answer is always tied to fear. Fear of disorder, fear of loss, fear of instability. Sexual regulation promised relief from these fears. It offered clear boundaries in a complex world. It assigned roles when uncertainty threatened identity. It reassured rulers and communities alike that chaos could be managed if bodies were kept in line. But fear is a poor foundation for justice. It narrows moral vision. It prioritizes control over care. It encourages punishment over understanding. And over time, it reshapes values until harm feels necessary. Ancient empires lived within that reshaped morality. They produced astonishing achievements: architecture, philosophy, law, art, while simultaneously embedding sexual domination into daily life. These were not contradictions. They were parallel outcomes of the same system. A system capable of organizing millions could also rationalize immense suffering. This is why studying sexual crimes in ancient empires changes how empire itself is understood. It reveals that greatness and brutality often grew from the same roots. Order was purchased with silence. Stability was maintained through inequality. Civilization advanced while countless lives were constrained, erased, or broken. This does not diminish history, it deepens it. Because depth requires honesty. And honesty demands that we resist romanticizing the past or isolating its violence as aberration. Sexual control was not a flaw at the edges of empire. It was part of its core logic. That logic did not disappear when empires fell. It fragmented, migrated, and reassembled in new forms. It entered legal traditions. It entered moral teachings. It entered everyday assumptions about whose voices matter. This is why the past feels close. Not because we repeat it exactly, but because we still negotiate with its inheritance. We still wrestle with belief and authority. We still struggle to balance order and dignity. We still debate whose suffering counts. These debates are ancient, and that realization carries a final weight. History does not guarantee progress. It offers perspective. It shows us patterns and consequences. It reveals what happens when power is allowed to define morality without challenge. The ancient empires show us how easily control can be mistaken for care, how often silence is confused with consent, how readily systems justify harm when it serves stability. They also show us something else. that these systems require constant reinforcement. They are not natural. They are maintained through effort, belief, and repetition, which means they can also be questioned. And questioning is where change begins, not with certainty, not with purity, but with the willingness to look clearly at what has been inherited and to decide consciously what should be carried forward and what should be left behind. This narration does not ask for judgment alone. It asks for awareness, because awareness disrupts inevitability. And once inevitability is disrupted, history stops being a script and becomes a choice. That choice belongs to the present, and the future is shaped by what we are willing to see. Religion did not stand apart from sexual control in the ancient world. It absorbed it, justified it, and gave it permanence. When law alone was not enough, religion stepped in, not as an alternative to power, but as its reinforcement. What kings enforced through decree, gods enforced through belief. What courts punished through sentence, religion punished through fear of divine judgment. This was one of the most effective shifts ancient societies ever made. Because a law can be broken when no one is watching, but a God is always watching. By linking sexual behavior to moral and cosmic order, ancient religions transformed regulation into obligation. Sexual obedience was no longer simply required by the state. It was demanded by the universe itself. To violate sexual norms was not just illegal, it was sinful, impure, dangerous. Religion framed sexuality as something inherently volatile, something that needed constant supervision. Desire was portrayed as a force that could disrupt families, anger gods, invite disaster. Control was presented not as domination but as protection, and people believed it. In many ancient traditions, sexual purity was tied directly to divine favor. A community's prosperity, its crops, its health, its survival, was believed to depend on moral discipline. When misfortune struck, sexual transgression was often blamed. Droughts, plagues, military defeat were interpreted as punishment for impurity. This created a powerful incentive to police behavior. Sexual crimes were no longer just private or legal matters. They became communal threats. A single body could endanger an entire population. This belief justified extreme responses. Punishment became purification. Violence became correction. Religion did not invent sexual hierarchy, but it sanctified it. Male authority was often framed as divinely ordained. Gods were imagined as male rulers, fathers, judges. Religious stories reinforced the idea that men were natural leaders and women were sources of temptation, disorder, or weakness. Female sexuality, in particular, was portrayed as something that required restraint for the good of all. These narratives mattered. They shaped how people understood harm. When a woman was violated, the question was not only what happened to her, but whether she had angered the divine order. Blame could shift easily. Silence became safer than confession. Endurance became a form of piety. Religious law codes often echoed and intensified secular ones. Sexual acts were categorized not by consent, but by purity. Clean and unclean, lawful and forbidden, sacred and profane. Once sexuality was framed this way, compassion became conditional. Mercy depended on conformity. Forgiveness required repentance, not from perpetrators alone, but often from victims as well. This is one of the most damaging effects of moralization. It relocates responsibility. Instead of asking who caused harm, the system asks who violated order. And order, as defined by religion, almost always aligned with existing power structures. Elite men could frame their actions as excess or temptation. Women were framed as sources of that temptation. Enslaved people were excluded from moral consideration entirely. Their suffering did not disrupt purity because their bodies were already defined as outside the moral center. Religion provided language that made this exclusion feel righteous. By declaring some bodies sacred and others expendable, moral systems reinforced social hierarchy. Holiness followed status, protection followed privilege. And because religion addressed eternal stakes, salvation, damnation, cosmic balance, its authority was difficult to challenge. Questioning sexual norms could be framed as heresy. Dissent became not just disobedience but betrayal of the divine. This made reform dangerous. Those who challenged sexual injustice risked not only social punishment but spiritual condemnation. To argue for bodily autonomy could be interpreted as moral corruption. To defend victims could be seen as endorsing impurity. Religion, in this way, narrowed the space for empathy, not always intentionally. Many believers acted with sincerity, convinced they were upholding goodness. But sincerity does not neutralize harm. When belief aligns too closely with power, it becomes difficult to distinguish morality from control. Ancient religions also emphasized visibility. Sexual behavior was monitored not only through law, but through ritual. Confession, purification rites, public penance, all reinforced the idea that sexuality was subject to scrutiny. Private life was never fully private. This constant observation shaped identity. People learned to see themselves through the lens of moral evaluation. Desire became something to fear. Bodies became sites of potential failure. Self-surveillance replaced external force. This internalization was one of religion's greatest contributions to social control, because once people police themselves, power no longer needs to act openly. Control becomes invisible, resistance becomes rare, and yet religion also preserved contradiction. While it condemned sexual disorder, it often tolerated sexual violence within hierarchy. Acts committed by those in authority could be excused, reframed, or forgiven. The moral weight of an action depended not on harm, but on who committed it and against whom. This selective morality reveals the underlying function of religious sexual codes. They were not primarily about reducing suffering, they were about preserving order. Order within families, order within communities, order within empire. Religion gave that order a sacred face, and once sacred, it became harder to dismantle than any law carved in stone. Because laws can be repealed, but beliefs linger. They persist in stories, rituals, language, and instinct. They shape how people feel about their bodies long after empires collapse. This is the enduring legacy of religion's role in sexual control. Not simply that it regulated behavior, but that it shaped conscience. It taught people what to fear, what to desire, and what to endure. It taught them which suffering mattered and which did not. Understanding this is not an attack on faith. It is an examination of power. Religion, like law, can protect or oppress. In ancient empires, it often did both. But when it aligned with hierarchy, it amplified control in ways that reached far beyond courts and armies. It reached into belief itself. And belief, once shaped, governs far longer than any empire ever could. And because belief governs from within, its influence is often the hardest to recognize and the slowest to fade. In the ancient world, religion did not simply dictate rules. It shaped meaning. It told people why things happened, why suffering occurred, and why inequality existed. Sexual order was woven into these explanations until it felt inseparable from reality itself. If a woman was punished, religion could explain it as justice. If a man was forgiven, religion could explain it as mercy. If violence occurred, religion could explain it as consequence rather than choice. This interpretive power was immense. It allowed communities to endure contradiction without confronting it. A system could claim moral purity while producing harm because the harm was reframed as necessary correction. The language of holiness softened brutality. Ritual transformed punishment into purification, and purification always sounded virtuous. Religious calendars reinforced this discipline. Periods of abstinence, fasting, and sexual restriction were framed as spiritually elevating. Desire became something to conquer, not understand. The body became a test rather than a home. This framing mattered deeply. When sexuality is treated primarily as a moral hazard, Harm against sexual bodies becomes easier to rationalize. Violence can be dismissed as unfortunate but secondary to preserving spiritual order. Compassion becomes conditional on compliance, and compliance, once again, fell unevenly. Men were often portrayed as morally strong, yet vulnerable to temptation. Women were portrayed as morally weak, yet responsible for restraint. This contradiction placed the burden of moral order on those with the least power to enforce it. When sexual norms were violated, women were expected to carry the shame, publicly, visibly, enduringly. Their bodies became evidence of disorder. Their punishment became reassurance to the community that order had been restored. Religion thus turned women into symbols, symbols of purity or impurity, symbols of obedience or rebellion, symbols of divine favor or divine wrath. Once reduced to symbols, individual suffering disappeared from view. Enslaved people occupied an even more precarious position. Many religious systems excluded them from full moral consideration while still demanding obedience. Their bodies were regulated when convenient and ignored when violated. Spiritual equality, when proclaimed, rarely translated into bodily protection. This gap between belief and practice was rarely acknowledged. To do so would have required confronting the alliance between religion and power, and that alliance was strong. Priests, scribes, and religious authorities often depended on imperial patronage. In return, they legitimized rule. Sexual order became one of the clearest ways to demonstrate moral leadership. Regulating bodies signaled divine favor. Punishing transgression demonstrated righteousness. Public morality became performance. Religious leaders who condemned sexual deviation were praised as defenders of virtue, even when they ignored or excused abuse within hierarchy. Condemnation flowed downward, protection flowed upward. This pattern was not universal, but it was widespread. And because religion spoke in absolutes, pure and impure, sacred and profane, it discouraged nuance. Complexity threatened clarity. Empathy threatened judgment. Listening threatened authority. So moral systems simplified reality. They reduced sexual violence to categories. They reduced victims to cases. They reduced suffering to lessons. These reductions made governance easier, but humanity thinner. Over time, religious sexual codes became embedded in identity. People did not merely follow them, they became them. To question sexual norms felt like questioning oneself, one's community, one's place in the universe. This is why religious sexual control survived political collapse. Empires fell, but faith remained. And with faith remained inherited assumptions about bodies, desire, and obedience. What had once been imperial strategy became moral instinct. That transformation was crucial, because when control feels instinctive, it no longer appears as control. It appears as truth. Truth about gender. Truth about sexuality. Truth about suffering. And truths, once believed, resist evidence. This does not mean ancient religions were monolithic or uniformly cruel. Within them existed compassion, care, and moments of radical empathy. But those moments were often constrained by the same structures they challenged. Faith could comfort the oppressed, but it also taught them endurance rather than resistance. Suffering was given meaning, but rarely redress. Hope was deferred rather than enacted. This too served power. A population that believes suffering has spiritual purpose is less likely to demand change. Endurance becomes virtue. Silence becomes strength. Injustice becomes test. Religion, in this way, did not merely regulate sexuality. It regulated expectation. It taught people what to hope for and what not to expect. It drew the boundaries of imagination. And imagination is dangerous to power. Because once people imagine alternatives, different moral orders, different relationships between body and authority, control weakens. Ancient empires understood this. That is why religious dissent was often punished as harshly as political rebellion. To challenge sexual morality was to challenge the foundation of order itself, so belief was guarded. Texts were interpreted narrowly. Rituals were standardized. Deviation was labeled corruption, all in service of stability. And yet, belief could never be perfectly controlled. Doubt persisted. Questions surfaced. Compassion broke through. The human experience resisted full containment. That tension between rigid moral order and lived reality ran through every ancient religious system. It never fully resolved. What remains for us, looking back, is not a verdict, but an understanding. Religion in ancient empires was neither purely oppressive nor purely liberating. It was a force, immensely powerful, that could be shaped by those who held authority. When aligned with hierarchy, it magnified control. When turned toward compassion, it hinted at alternatives. But the dominant pattern is clear. Sexual morality was used to preserve order more than to protect people. Belief became an instrument of governance, and governance reached into the most intimate parts of life. That legacy still matters. Because whenever morality is used to silence suffering, whenever purity is valued over dignity, whenever belief excuses harm, we are seeing echoes of ancient alignment between religion and power. Understanding that alignment does not require rejecting faith. It requires separating belief from domination. And that separation, rare in the ancient world, is one of the most difficult challenges any society faces. Because belief shapes conscience, and conscience, once formed, governs long after laws have changed. This is the enduring role of religion in moral order, not only in what it commanded, but in what it made feel unquestionable. And that is why its influence on sexual control has lasted so long and reached so far beyond the empires that first shaped it. Sexual violence in the context of empire was never only about individual cruelty. It was a strategy, a language of power spoken through bodies when words were no longer enough. Empires understood something brutal and effective. Nothing communicates domination more clearly than control over another person's body. Land can be taken back, armies can be defeated, laws can be rewritten. But sexual violence leaves marks that persist, psychological, social, generational. This is why it appears so consistently in moments of conquest. When armies entered foreign cities, sexual violence was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was an expected outcome, sometimes tolerated, sometimes encouraged, rarely punished. The violation of bodies signaled the collapse of resistance and the absolute authority of the victor. To violate was to announce ownership. In many ancient cultures, women's bodies symbolized the honor, continuity, and identity of a community. Violating them was not only an attack on individuals, it was an attack on the social fabric itself. It humiliated men who failed to protect their women. It fractured families. It rewrote power relationships overnight. Sexual violence, in this sense, was political theater. It communicated to the conquered that their old order was finished, that their gods had failed them, that their lineage, their honor, their future now existed at the mercy of empire. And it worked. Communities broken this way were easier to govern. Trauma silenced resistance. Shame discouraged rebellion. Fear replaced solidarity. Empire did not need to occupy every street when it occupied memory. This logic extended beyond the battlefield. In occupied territories, sexual violence often became routine rather than exceptional. Enslaved populations were especially vulnerable. Enslavement erased sexual autonomy entirely. Sexual access became a privilege of ownership embedded into economic systems and legal frameworks. The bodies of enslaved women were used to reproduce labor forces. Children born of violence inherited bondage. Sexual exploitation became self-perpetuating. Violence generated profit. This was not chaos, it was structure. Imperial systems rarely punished sexual violence against the enslaved because doing so would have required recognizing them as persons rather than property. And empire depended on that distinction remaining intact. Even among free populations, sexual violence followed hierarchy. Elite men were shielded. Soldiers were excused, officials were protected. Accountability flowed downward, never upward. When punishment occurred, it was often symbolic, designed to preserve appearances rather than deliver justice. Justice was not the goal. Control was. Sexual violence also functioned as a warning. It told people what would happen if they resisted. It reminded them of their vulnerability. It reinforced their position in the hierarchy. The knowledge that one's body could be violated without consequence was itself a form of domination. It disciplined behavior long before violence occurred. This threat extended into daily life. In imperial cities, the presence of occupying forces, officials, and elites created constant sexual risk for those without protection. Fear shaped movement. Silence shaped survival. Accommodation became strategy. Resistance did not disappear, but it became costly. Sexual violence, in this way, narrowed the space for defiance. It made rebellion not only dangerous, but deeply personal. The price of resistance could be borne by loved ones rather than fighters. That calculation broke movements before they began. Empire relied on this. And like all imperial tools, sexual violence was normalized through narrative. Victims were blamed for provoking harm. Conquered populations were portrayed as inferior, immoral, or deserving. Enslaved people were depicted as naturally available. These stories reduced empathy and protected perpetrators. Violence became invisible when justified. Language played a crucial role. Acts were described euphemistically. Records focused on ownership, not violation. Bodies were counted, not mourned. This bureaucratic framing stripped violence of emotion and transformed it into administration. Administration is easier to defend than brutality. This framing also allowed empire to present itself as civilizing, even benevolent. Order was restored. Law was imposed. Stability returned. What happened to bodies in the process was treated as incidental. But it was never incidental. Sexual violence reshaped populations. It altered family structures. It changed demographics. It left psychological scars that persisted long after borders stabilized. Empire did not just conquer land, it reconfigured intimacy. And this reconfiguration had lasting effects. Children born of sexual violence occupied ambiguous social positions. Women carried stigma long after the event. Men carried humiliation they were not permitted to express. Communities internalized defeat. These outcomes were not side effects, they were advantages. Empire thrived on fragmentation. Trauma divided people who might otherwise unite. Shame isolated individuals who might otherwise resist. Silence ensured continuity. This is why sexual violence as imperial control is so difficult to confront. It reveals a level of calculation that contradicts comforting narratives about ancient warfare and governance. It shows that empire was not only built with roads, laws, and armies, but with violated bodies and enforced silence. And it shows that control operates most effectively when it is intimate. Because when power reaches the body, it no longer needs to persuade. It simply dominates. Understanding this does not require us to believe that every act was planned or ordered. Systems do not require constant instruction. They create conditions where certain behaviors are rewarded, excused, or ignored. Sexual violence flourished in empire because empire made space for it. That is the hardest truth. Not that cruelty existed, but that it was useful. And when cruelty is useful, it becomes policy without ever being written down. This is sexual violence as imperial control, not chaos, not accident, but strategy, executed through hierarchy, silence, and power. And its effects, like empire itself, lasted far longer than the moment of conquest. And because it was strategic, sexual violence did not end when conquest ended. It settled in. It became part of the everyday architecture of imperial rule. Once territories were secured, empire shifted from terror to maintenance. Open brutality gave way to regulated domination. But sexual control remained central. It simply changed form. In garrison towns and imperial cities, Soldiers and officials lived among the conquered. Their presence altered the balance of power in every marketplace, every household, every street. Access to protection, food, work, or legal favor often depended on proximity to authority. That proximity carried risk. Sexual coercion thrived in this imbalance. What could not be taken openly on the battlefield could be extracted quietly in daily life. Consent blurred under pressure. Survival strategies were mistaken for choice. Silence was interpreted as agreement. Empire rarely asked questions it did not want answered. For many women in occupied territories, sexual vulnerability became a constant condition rather than an isolated event. Avoidance shaped routines. Dependency shaped relationships. Compliance became a way to reduce harm rather than invite it. This form of control was subtle, but no less effective. Because it taught people to anticipate domination, to calculate risk before speaking, moving, or resisting, to internalize the limits of what was possible. This anticipation is one of the most powerful tools of empire. When people adjust their behavior in advance, power no longer needs to intervene. The threat alone is enough. Sexual violence also worked through legal ambiguity. Imperial law often created gray zones where abuse could occur without clear accountability. Jurisdiction was unclear. Testimony was discounted. Status overrode experience. A soldier's word outweighed a civilian's. A citizen's body mattered more than a subject's. This ambiguity protected perpetrators while exhausting victims. Pursuing justice required resources, witnesses, and credibility, things the vulnerable rarely possessed. The process itself could be dangerous. Speaking out risked retaliation, disbelief, or further harm. So many did not speak, and silence, once widespread, becomes evidence in itself. Authorities interpret it as absence of abuse rather than absence of safety. The system reassures itself. Empire depended on this reassurance. It allowed rulers to claim order while violence continued beneath the surface. It preserved the image of civilization while domination remained intact. Sexual violence also reinforced loyalty among the powerful. Shared impunity binds groups together. When soldiers, officials, or elites know they are protected, they become invested in the system that protects them. Their silence becomes mutual. Accountability becomes betrayal. This is how violence becomes institutional, not through constant command, but through shared benefit. Those who violated bodies were not always rewarded explicitly, but they were rarely punished. That absence of consequence was itself a signal. It communicated permission without ever stating it. Permission is the lifeblood of systemic abuse. Empire also used sexual violence symbolically beyond immediate victims. Stories circulated, rumors spread. The knowledge that such acts occurred and went unpunished disciplined entire populations. Fear traveled faster than law. Parents warned daughters. Communities adapted behavior. Resistance recalculated its cost. The reach of empire extended far beyond physical presence. And this reach lasted. Long after armies withdrew, the memory of violation shaped relationships between rulers and ruled. Trust eroded. Suspicion lingered. Trauma embedded itself into cultural memory. Empire did not just conquer space. It altered time. Generations inherited fear they could not name. Norms shifted around protection and obedience. Sexual caution became cultural wisdom, passed down as advice rather than protest. This is how violence becomes tradition, not because it is celebrated, but because it is anticipated. One of the most devastating aspects of sexual violence as imperial control is that it targets reproduction itself. By violating bodies, empire disrupted lineage, inheritance, and identity. Children born of violence carried the mark of domination into the future. Some were absorbed, some were rejected. All were reminders. In this way, empire wrote itself into bloodlines. And because these children existed, the violence could never be fully erased. It remained visible in families, in social divisions, in inherited stigma. This visibility served power too. It reminded the conquered that domination was not temporary, that its consequences were lasting, that resistance would echo beyond the moment. Sexual violence thus functioned as both message and method, a message that power was absolute, a method for sustaining that power without constant force. Understanding this forces us to abandon the idea that empire ruled primarily through law or consent. It ruled through the management of fear, and sexual violence was one of its most efficient tools. Not because it was constant everywhere, but because it was possible anywhere. Possibility alone was enough. And when domination becomes possible without consequence, it becomes inevitable. That is the legacy of sexual violence as imperial control. Not simply that it occurred, but that it was woven into the logic of rule, quietly, persistently, and with devastating effectiveness. And that logic, once learned, does not easily disappear. It waits until conditions allow it to surface again. Fear and shame were not accidental byproducts of punishment in ancient empires. They were the purpose. When sexual crimes were punished publicly, the goal was never only to discipline the individual, it was to instruct everyone else. Justice, as we understand it today, was secondary. What mattered was visibility. Executions were staged. Bodies were displayed. Exile was announced. Mutilation was made unmistakable. These punishments were meant to be seen, remembered, and retold. The pain of one person was converted into a lesson for thousands. Fear did the first part of the work. It reminded people that authority was watching, that boundaries were enforced, that deviation carried consequences that could not be negotiated away. Fear shortened imaginations. It narrowed choices. It taught people to calculate risk before desire. But fear alone was not enough. Fear fades when power is absent. Shame endured. Shame followed people home. It lingered in families, in reputations, in memory. Unlike fear, which comes from above, shame works from within. It teaches individuals to police themselves. Ancient societies understood this deeply. Sexual shame was attached not only to acts, but to identity. A person marked by sexual punishment was not simply someone who had done wrong. They were someone who was wrong, tainted, dishonored, dangerous. This transformation from action to identity was critical because it meant that punishment did not end when the sentence ended. Shame outlived exile. It outlived wounds. It outlived the event itself. It reshaped how communities saw a person and how that person saw themselves. Women bore the heaviest burden of this system. Sexual norms were rigid, and deviation, real or alleged, carried disproportionate consequences. A woman accused of sexual wrongdoing could lose family protection, social standing, and the possibility of survival. Even when violence was committed against her, shame often attached to her body rather than to the act. Public punishment made this clear. When women were punished publicly, the message was unmistakable. Obedience was expected, visibility was dangerous, and silence was safer than truth. The spectacle was not just corrective, it was preventative. It warned others what could happen. Men, too, were disciplined through fear and shame, but differently. Punishment reinforced hierarchy rather than challenging it. A man was punished when he violated another man's authority, not when he harmed someone below him. Shame followed failure of status, not abuse of power. This selective application revealed the true function of punishment. It was not about morality, it was about order. Public enforcement transformed private behavior into collective responsibility. Families monitored each other. Neighbors reported suspicion. Communities absorbed the role of surveillance. The state did not need to watch everyone when everyone watched themselves. This collective discipline was powerful. It blurred the line between law and custom, between authority and habit. People enforced norms not because soldiers stood nearby, but because deviation risked communal rejection, and rejection could be fatal. In societies where survival depended on kinship and reputation, shame was a weapon more devastating than physical punishment. To be cast out was to be unprotected. To be unprotected was to be vulnerable to everything. This is why public punishment focused so intensely on sexual behavior. Sexuality touched lineage, honor, inheritance, and identity. To control it was to control the future, and to punish it publicly was to ensure compliance across generations. Children learned by watching. They learned which bodies were disciplined, which behaviors were dangerous, which silences were rewarded. These lessons did not need explanation. The spectacle explained itself. Public punishment also absolved the system. By focusing attention on the punished individual, structural violence disappeared from view. The community could believe that disorder had been removed, that justice had been done, that balance had been restored. The system appeared moral. And because punishment was framed as necessary, even compassionate, empathy for the punished was discouraged. To feel compassion was to question order. To question order was to risk association with disorder. So compassion retreated, obedience advanced. This is how fear and shame worked together. Fear enforced boundaries. Shame maintained them. Together they created a population that rarely needed to be punished because it had learned to punish itself. Sexual crime laws, in this context, were less about responding to harm and more about maintaining discipline. Individual suffering was irrelevant unless it threatened hierarchy. What mattered was whether norms were upheld. Public enforcement reinforced this lesson relentlessly. Justice was not individualized. Context did not matter. Consent was secondary. What mattered was the message. And the message was clear. Bodies belong to order, not to themselves. This system did not require constant brutality to function. It required memory. Memory of punishment, memory of shame, memory of what happened to those who stepped outside the line. That memory shaped behavior long after the execution ended, long after the crowd dispersed, long after the empire itself faded. Fear and shame are efficient tools of control because they outlast force. And in ancient empires, they ensured that sexual discipline was not just enforced, it was internalized. That internalization is the deepest form of power. Because when control lives inside people, authority no longer needs to speak. It is already obeyed. Fear and shame were not simply methods used by ancient empires. They were the final lock that kept the entire system in place. By the time punishment was made public, by the time bodies were displayed, names were erased, and lives were broken, the work of control was already nearly complete. The spectacle was not meant to correct one person. It was meant to settle into the minds of everyone watching. And it did. Public executions, exile, and mutilation were designed to be unforgettable. They turned law into theater and suffering into instruction. Each punishment carried a message far more important than the individual case itself. This is what happens when you step outside the order. Fear spread quickly, but shame spread deeper. Fear told people what power could do to them. Shame told them who they would become if it did. Shame attached itself to memory, to reputation, to identity. It outlived wounds and sentences. It followed families for generations. Once marked, a person was never fully restored, not in the eyes of the community, and often not in their own. This is why sexual punishment was so effective. Sexual norms were already tied to honor, gender roles, lineage, and belonging. When punishment struck there, it struck at the core of social existence. To be shamed sexually was not just to be punished, it was to be removed from full humanity. And everyone understood that. Women learned that visibility was dangerous, that silence was safer than truth, that survival often depended on compliance, even in the face of injustice. Men learned where authority ended and where it did not. Enslaved people learned that the law was not meant for them at all. Children learned these lessons without words. They learned by watching bodies punished, by hearing stories whispered, by sensing which questions were never asked. In this way, fear and shame became educators. They taught obedience more efficiently than any law or decree. Public enforcement also ensured that responsibility was shared. When punishment happened in the open, the community became complicit. Witnesses became participants. Silence became agreement. This collective discipline was the empire's final triumph. Because once people police one another, once they internalize the boundaries and enforce them themselves, power no longer needs to intervene constantly. The system sustains itself, and justice, as we would recognize it today, disappears. Individual circumstances no longer matter, consent no longer matters, suffering no longer matters. What matters is whether order has been restored. This is where ancient empires reveal their deepest truth. They were not sustained primarily by armies, laws, or rulers. They were sustained by fear that narrowed possibility and shame that governed identity. Sexual control was one of the most effective ways to produce both. By the end, punishment was almost unnecessary. Most people already knew their place. That is the final legacy of sexual crimes and social control in ancient empires. Not simply that violence occurred, but that it was made meaningful, transformed into warning, discipline, and memory. Not simply that bodies were punished, but that entire societies learned to anticipate punishment and adjust themselves accordingly. The empires eventually fell, their monuments crumbled, their borders dissolved. But the systems they perfected did not vanish overnight. Fear and shame linger longer than stone. They pass quietly from generation to generation. They survive even when their origins are forgotten. And that is why this history matters. Because understanding how sexual control functioned in the past is not about dwelling on ancient cruelty. It is about recognizing how power works when it wants to last. It is about seeing how order can be built on silence and how discipline can be mistaken for morality. This narration ends here, not because the subject is exhausted, but because the pattern is now clear. Control does not always announce itself. It often teaches itself, and once learned, it is difficult to unlearn. What happens next, what we choose to question, what we refuse to normalize, what we are willing to see, that does not belong to history. It belongs to us.